Today we're going to talk about epidemiology and oral health. So I just want to start out with a literal definition of epidemiology, like what comes when you break down the word and where it came from. And when you break down the word epidemiology, it says that it's the study of that which befalls man. So it is the study or the science of that which affects populations to a large amount and befalls them. A more scientific definition, something a little more helpful, is that epidemiology is the study of the distribution and determinants of health related states or events in specific populations, and the application of that study in order to control a health problem. Epidemiologists study how often a disease occurs and why. Their unit of concern are groups of people or populations of people and not individuals. I want to take this moment to clarify that when we discuss epidemiology and we use the word disease, we're not necessarily discussing infectious diseases or bacteria or viruses, but anything that's affecting the population as a whole, which could be a chronic illness, it could be cancers, or even an event like a homicides or suicides. Epidemiology considers the interactions and relationships among multiple factors that can influence the health status and health problems of a population. Epidemiology factors analyze the distribution, the dynamics within the population, the occurrence of the event, who is being affected, and where, and at what time, as well as other determinants. So what they're comparing are occurrences of that health event. They're occurring whether the location of where they occur, the time they occur, variations like the dynamic within the population or cultural characteristics to assess the distribution and what's going on with a health event. I'm going to take this moment to discuss one of epidemiology's favorite guys, Jon Snow. Not related to the Game of Thrones Jon Snow, though who knows, right? He is considered the father of modern epidemiology. This is because of his work on tracing the source of a cholera outbreak in London in 1854. And this is considered one of the most famous events in the history of epidemiology because it was kind of one of the first things where something was mapped out, measured, and we were able to determine what was going on. So, what was going on in London is thousands of people were losing their lives to an outbreak of cholera, and Jon Snow performed a natural experiment in order to find out where the cause was. At this time, several water companies would pump drinking water to community pumps that people would come and fill whatever their apparatus was with water. So what Jon Snow did is he mapped out where the mortality and death rates were for residents, and he found that they were most concentrated around one specific water pump. If you can see here on this map, which is a updated version of his map, all the red dots were areas that someone had died from cholera, and all the blue dots are the various water pumps within that community. You can see there's this one central pump that all of these incidences seem to be surrounded by. Eventually, he was able to convince authorities to remove that pump handle, and the epidemic subsided. So, this is the first time someone mapped out a pattern, measured that distribution, and then was able to identify the determinant. A fun fact is that this pump here, this is a recent picture. This is the pump that Jon Snow found, and it's still up today, not to be used, of course. There's no water coming out of that. But if you find yourself in Soho, London, and the corner of Broad Street and Lexington Street, you'll find this pump. Just an interesting, fun thing in our worlds today. I know it's a bucket list item for me to get a picture by that pump. But let's talk about epidemiology. We have descriptive epidemiology first. Descriptive epidemiology is the first step to looking at a disease, and generally it uses existing data that we already have. The focus is on the person, time, and place. So the person is the personal characteristics that affect the distribution of the disease. These characteristics may be inherent, like age, sex, and race. They may be biological, like our immune status, or acquired, like marriage status. They could be activities like our occupation, medications, tobacco use, or they can be based on the conditions that someone's living in, their socioeconomical status, or access to medical care. Time is how often a disease occurs, and this is constantly changing. And it's specific to the disease that's being looked at. The time can be seasonal, like the flu or the swine flu, or they can be unpredictable, like salmonella. Understanding the patterns of disease occurrence is crucial for monitoring a disease within a community and assessing whether the public health intervention is actually working. Place showcases the extent of the problem geographically. Locations can include not only a residence, but any area that's relevant to the disease. So this includes place of diagnosis, a birthplace, employment, a school district, travel areas, and hospitals. Sometimes it can refer to urban, rural, domestic, or foreign as well. This helps to identify which communities are at increased risk of a disease. Examples of descriptive epidemiology are cross sectional studies, case series, correlation studies. Analytical epidemiology it goes beyond the descriptive epidemiology. Descriptive epidemiology uses observations to form a hypothesis about the cause or patterns, as well as risk factors, but it doesn't test those theories. Analytical epidemiology tests the hypothesis either through an experimental study or through an observational study. Experimental studies, the investigator determines through a controlled process the exposure of an individual or community. And then they track that individual or community to understand the effects of the disease exposure. An example in dentistry would be a clinical trial testing fluoride varnish effectiveness on preventing caries. One half of that study would get the varnish and one half would receive a placebo. And then you would see what the effect would have on caries rates. Ethically, these studies are generally not as possible as a descriptive study because you're giving somebody treatment or you can't give somebody, you have all those ethical issues about whether somebody's getting the placebo and they need it, whether they don't know if they're getting treatment or not. So the exception really is intervention or trials or clinical trials where they actually test treatments and patients are aware that they're in a experimental group. Observational studies are around, or because experimental studies are not always ethically possible, a study design may be chosen where the impact or health effect is observed in a population that's already segregated into groups. So those groups are organized by experience, exposure, disease. That could be married versus single, smoker versus non-smoker, caries versus no caries. The issue with this is always to figure out what the confounding variables could be. The observed groups may have different things going on in their lives that are actually affecting the situation that's going on, and those need to be found out in order to have a true study or to get true results. The biggest difference when you're thinking of experimental versus observational, in experimental, the investigator kind of determines the exposure that the patient goes through or the community goes through. And in observational, the subjects are kind of enrolled based on exposure they already have. Examples are cohort studies or case control studies. Many factors influence the health of individuals and communities. You have your inherited determinants that can be inborn or determined genetically. And these are beyond the control of the individual, and this is their age, sex, and hereditary factors. There are also acquired determinants that are obtained after birth and throughout life, like your cultural values and influences, spiritual values, infections, and trauma that may have existed in your life. And these are these individual lifestyle factors and social and community networks. Where we live determines a lot about how we view health and a lot about our well-being. Broader determinants are influenced by environment and access, like your education, unemployment, your access to health care. And in order to truly improve the health of a community and affect change, as many of these determinants as possible should be targeted. And the same is true for oral health. Not only are there multiple influences on oral health, but improving oral health will improve the general health of the population. So it's just important to understand that there's all these different issues and things that we need to find in order to create an effective public health program. An example is sugar. So, sugar affects a person's systemic health on many levels. It causes obesity, diabetes, oral health, it affects chronic issues. And there are many different campaigns that are focused on decreasing person's sugar consumption. And some may be for oral reasons, some may be for obesity reasons, but all of them, if successful, are going to actually infect all those different areas. So even if you have a campaign that's just on oral health and sugar, if you decrease someone's sugar consumption, it's going to affect all those other areas of their health. It's just a good mindset that improving health in all areas is achievable as long as you're kind of hitting different groups. That is all for this one. Here's my references. I hope you have a great day and look forward to your discussion posts.